Really
good evening.
It's actually a folder with all the little scorecards.
Clearly we're among friends here, and I hate to cut you off, but I'd like to go ahead and get us started. My name is Gary Adler. I'm the Director of Research for the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. Normally you would look around and you'd see a number of other staff members here from the Institute today, but I'm it. I'm holding down the fort. Sheila Garrison, who many of you know, her son is graduating from Marine Basic Training today. Father Heft is caught in traffic, as is Todd Thaxton. So it's LA, we expect these things. A couple reminders before we get started. If you've got one of these friendly little devices in your pocket or your purse, please go ahead and take an opportunity to turn those off. We're, like all of our lectures, we're going to be recording this one to be able to put on our website. So that means a couple of things. It means, first off, that when we do Q&A, I'll have a microphone and I'll walk around to you. So if you want to talk, put your hand up. I swear I'll see you, and then I'll bring it to you. You just got to wait till I get to you. And then it also means that if you dance in front of the video camera, that will appear on the web someday. So keep that in mind. Normally, I would take a chance to introduce Father Heft, who's the president of the Institute and also the Alton Brooks Professor of Religion here at USC. If you don't know Father Heft, he'll be here in a little bit. I encourage you to get to know him afterwards as our speech ends this evening. I'd like to go ahead now and take a moment to introduce our speaker. Before I do that, though, I'll mention that this speaker series, which has been on hiatus since the spring semester, is really dedicated to bringing some of the brightest and most creative minds around to think about challenges that are confronting the Catholic Church in the United States and abroad, that are confronting the larger public, and that are confronting where the Catholic Church and the public intersect. And I think our speaker is going to speak nicely to that today and really kick off a chain of speeches that we're going to have. I put a whole bunch of cards in back there, but make sure to grab one of these, because our next set of speakers after today's are really going to take us a little deeper into some of the issues within the Catholic Church regarding the real explosion of Latino Catholicism in this decade and the decades to go. So our speaker tonight is Manuel Pastor. He is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity here at USC. He has helped to found a number of centers focused on justice for minorities and immigrant groups, including 2 centers here right at USC. And he just told me that today, they've just, one of his centers on immigrant integration has just released a brand new report on indicators of social, economic, and cultural integration in California. So you can go and check that out. I imagine there's probably even a USC press release about it on the media page if you want more information. He is published in top journals of urban planning as well as international development. He's won a ton of fellowships and grants from the likes of the Guggenheim, Kellogg, Irvine, Rockefeller, Ford, and the National Science Foundations. Now, this should give you a real quick sense of his interest and scholarly accomplishments. But to understand his vision for confronting issues related to inequality, it helps to know a bit more about him as a person. So when I was trying to find some information about Dr. Pastor, I came upon a wonderful biography that was written and posted on the Funders Network, which is an association, I believe, of foundations and big nonprofits to get to know some creative minds today. And so I just want to finish my introduction by reading just a passage from this report. During his school years, Manuel Pastor's teachers neither expected nor encouraged him to go to college. The son of a janitor who eventually became an air conditioning repairman, Pastor grew up in working-class communities in Southern California, where students, especially students of color, were not generally considered college material. His rise to becoming a nationally renowned academic and thought leader is a classic American beat-the-odds story. But Pastor doesn't think anyone should have to beat the odds just to get an education, and he's devoted his career to making sure that opportunity isn't reduced to a game of chance. Tonight, Dr. Pastor invites us into the latest lines of his thinking in this lifelong project. Please welcome Dr. Manuel Pastor.
Thank you. That was a very cool introduction. I'm going to remember that and introduce myself that way to my students in the future. It should be exciting. Glad to be with you all, and glad to be here tonight. And I do want to, and I just find it so interesting that your staff is either stuck in traffic or doing marine training. So I'm suspecting that if I do well, you'll let me be stuck in traffic. If I do badly, I'll have to go do marine training. Yes, so hopefully you'll enjoy this. What I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the demographic changes that are happening in the United States, and also that are happening in particular in California and Los Angeles, a little bit about what that means for the Catholic Church, actually, but then some intersections more broadly with what that means around issues of social inequality in the United States, and in particular the future of the United States, and what we're going to need to do to address that. And the punchline of that is that faith will be an important part of bridging generations, of bridging geographies, of bridging communities. Catholics will play a role in that, but all sorts of faith-based movements will play a role in that, and that's really where I want to head. So if you've ever been in a class before, you realize that I just told you what I'm going to say, which means that some of you can doze for the next 30 minutes or so, and then kind of tune back in the thrilling and emotional conclusion that I will come to. So I'm going to go through some slides. I don't know whether the lights in the front go down at all. It might be helpful for people to be able to see that. I bet our technician can help. Finally, let me mention as we get started that as I talk, my voice might break a little bit. It's actually because I have a speech disorder that developed over the last couple of years, and it gets treated once a month with Botox, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So, so let me go through a little bit of this. When for some of you, Christmas Day means something very important, the celebration of the birth of Christ. When you're younger, it just means that you're getting gifts, right? And when you're a demographer, the equivalent of Christmas Day is Census Day, right? When the numbers come out and you can open the top of the box and look inside to see what toys are there. And in the 2010 census, there was a remarkable set of statistics, and I'll talk a little bit about them, that came out. One was simply the growth rates of communities in the United States. And between 2000 and 2010, the Latino or Hispanic community grew by 43%. The Asian Pacific Island community grew by 43%. Remarkable coincidence. I think they were coordinating. The African American community grew by about 11%, the non-Hispanic white community by 1% in the U.S. as a whole. So 43%, 1%, very dramatic differences in the growth rates. Now, when people hear about those growth rates, the 43%, particularly for the Latino community, what do most people think is driving that growth rate? Immigration. And is that correct? No, it is no longer correct. In fact, immigration flows to the United States have been going down for the last couple of years. It's not just a function of a slower economy attracting less people or increased border enforcement pushing away more people. It's actually a result of a fundamental change in the demographic push factor from Mexico, the fertility rate. It used to be about 25, 30 years ago that every woman in Mexico had about 5 children over the course of her lifetime. Now it's down to 2.4. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.7. So the fertility rates have closed dramatically. And secondly, the economies in Latin America, while no great shakes, when you look northward, you go, geez, that's definitely no great shakes, right? And so there's less of an economic push factor from Latin America as well. There's great stories of people returning, for example, to Brazil because they have a higher likelihood of getting a job there than trying to get a job in the United States. So we actually no longer, while I know most people in the political world are worried about too much immigration, people who are economists are worried about less immigration in the future because that's what replenishes the labor supply and keeps the U.S. economy moving forward. So our changes are actually being driven by a second and third generation of people settling their kids in the United States. And what that means is that by the year 2042, and we'll look at California in a minute, by the year 2042, the United States will become a so-called majority-minority nation. That is, the majority of people will be people of color, African American, Latino, Asian Pacific American. By the year 2019, 2020, the majority of youth, people under the age of 18, will be people of color. And it was last year that the majority of births were to people of color, something that we'd been predicting would happen, and people were surprised that it happened so quickly. We weren't. And this shows you a little bit about what's driving this. So, for example, between 2000 and 2010, the number of young whites in the country fell by 4.3 million. Now, that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. That would have been a big headline, right? What it means is that more people are moving into being 19, 20 than are moving into 1, 2, right? So the net number of young whites falls. Interestingly, the number of young African Americans, people under the age of 18, also fell by 250,000. The number of young Latinos rose by 4.8 million. The number of API, Asian Pacific Island, young people rose by about 800,000. And there was a big rise in the number of people who identify themselves as other. That is, they identify themselves as multiracial or simply other, not fitting. Now, what does that mean in terms of American Catholics? One of the things that's interesting is the national, the source there disappeared, but it's the National Catholic Reporter, right, which does a survey every once in a while on Catholics, and this is the Catholics in America survey they did, and it looks at, the first one they did was in 1987, just as the Pope was arriving, so they could present him with a poll, because what would make a Pope happier than a survey? And then in 2011, they did it again, I guess, in hopes of persuading the Pope to come again. So what the data tell us about Catholics, and it's a little interesting to kind of pull out, is a very interesting thing. First, the share of Catholics who are white has fallen dramatically, and the share of Catholics who are Hispanic has risen dramatically. 1987, 10% of self-identified Catholics in the United States were Hispanic or Latino. Now it's about a third. Interestingly, probably bad news for the church, less people who are married, more people who are living with their partner. And what's interesting here is the Catholic population is getting older. If you look at the share that's either above the age of 55 or 45 to 54, that's older, right? And what that's masking is the interesting thing. Amongst those who are young, nearly the majority are Latino or Hispanic, right? So the ranks of the Catholic Church at the level of the young are actually being replenished by this growing Hispanic presence in the United States. Now, what does that mean in California? California has actually been through this set of trends before, right? This shows you what happened in California between 1980 and 2000. The observant person will notice the following. In 2000, the United States was 69% non-Hispanic white. It's projected to be about 45% non-Hispanic white in 2050. That's 50 years of change, right? That is basically the demographic change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. So that 20 years between 1980 and 2000 basically kind of sandwiched in, right, telescoped what is happening in the rest of the United States over the next 50 years, right? And those were bumpy years indeed for race relations in California, largest civil unrest in U.S. history in Los Angeles, issues around undocumented immigration, fights around Proposition 187, fights around affirmative action, etc. But we seem to have come out of it in sort of interesting ways that I'll talk a little bit. But demographers say that they know actually the exact day that we became majority-minority. You may have seen how demographers do this. They go, the 300 millionth baby was born today, right? His name is Jose. He lives in Pacoima. You're like, how did you know that, right? Well, on December 15th, 1999, demographers said again we'd become majority-minority in the state of California. I was living in Northern California at the time and working at UC Santa Cruz, and I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long, a little bit nervous actually, going, we've become majority-minority, majority-minority, majority-minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? And finally I got very frustrated, and I said, I don't know, but we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited, right? but they just have to learn a new step, right? And part of what we're all doing is learning a new step with each other, right? About that changing demography, about the way that communities can interact and intersect, and what does it mean to lead, not just in one community, but across multiple communities, right? What's it mean to lead in the Catholic Church when its demographics are changing so rapidly? What's it mean to lead in a society where so many people are dropping out of faith-based institutions? What's it mean to lead around spiritual, moral, social justice issues? And of course, California heading forward, its demography will continue to change. By the year 2032, somewhere in there, California will become a majority Latino state, which means people will have to say California the right way. Los Angeles, right, will once again become Los Angeles, and some places will stay the same. I think Manhattan Beach will probably still be pronounced Manhattan Beach, and it may actually even still look like Manhattan Beach. You never know. So, changing demography as we move forward over time. And again, what's interesting is that this is no longer going to be propelled by immigration. It'll be propelled by the maturation of a second and third generation population. Here's a statistic I bet you didn't know, but I know you can guess the answer at now. What is the only large metro area of the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States? So places like Orlando and Las Vegas and Detroit and New York and Oakland and San Francisco and Santa Clara and Minneapolis. What is the only large metropolitan area between 2000 and 2010 that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children? LA, right? Because LA, and if you look at the demographics, LA's shares didn't change that much between 2000 and 2010. It's not getting a huge increase in the number of Hispanic children because less immigrants are coming in. It's older family formation, et cetera, right? So we're coming to the end of a process. And what's interesting is that for California, we're going to have to deal a lot more with a more settled immigrant population and a more second-generation population. This ranks all of the states in terms of who's got the most settled immigrant population, the percentage of the population that's been in the country for longer than 10 years. You can see that for California, about 70% of our immigrants have actually been in the country for longer than 10 years. Even 50% of our undocumented residents have been in the country for longer than 10 years. The only state with a more settled immigrant population is Vermont. And that's because they have 2 immigrants, right? And those guys have been there for a while. So it's kind of an outlier in the data. So when people hear about this demographic change, particularly for California as a whole, what they think is going on is that the demographic change means that, yes, California will change, but not their particular part of it, right? That instead what will happen will be that Los Angeles will become 150% Latino, right? And then that will change the demographics for the rest of the state. So this shows you the counties arrayed by the percent people of color, and the browner the county, basically the browner the county, more Latinos and African Americans and Asians. And you can see that the county actually that had the most highest percent people of color is kind of Imperial County, right by the Mexican border, and then followed by Los Angeles in 2000. This is what it looks like in 2010, 2020, 2030, 2040, and as far as we can project into 2050, right? So this demographic change is occurring, all over California, and if we did the U.S. map, you'd see it's occurring all over the United States as well. What I like to say about this is if you have some friends who are living in some of the lighter areas before, and they don't have a good taqueria near them now, don't worry. One is coming, right? So demographic change happening all over the U.S., and this is what's been going on in Los Angeles County, where I'm presuming most of you are from. So this is 1980, non-Hispanic whites. The lighter the color, the higher the percent non-Hispanic whites. Basically, this was a phenomena for the borders of Orange County and the coastal borders and Malibu, western part of San Fernando Valley as well. As you move into 1990, 2000, 2010, you could see very dramatic changes. The percent African American, what's interesting about what happened for the African American community is that in 1980, well, I mean, we live right here. In 1980, South LA was 80% African American. Today, South LA is 2/3 Latino. right? And that South LA area is this darker green area here. It's also where USC is. And you can see that what's gone on between 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010 has been two phenomena. One, and you'll see it in a minute, is a movement into South LA of lots of Latinos. And the second is a dispersal of lots of the African Americans into the Inland Empire, the San Fernando Valley, Palmdale, Lancaster, a sort of movement out of South LA. It's also been an interesting movement into places like Hawthorne, Inglewood, and Lawndale. This is the Latino population, same time period, and you can see massive growth. One interesting place that people don't understand there's been a lot of growth is in the San Fernando Valley. The San Fernando Valley retains this image of the Valley Girl, right? Of suburbia, of Encino, which apparently Snoop Dogg has a place up there, so it definitely has changed demographically. But you can see that the eastern part of the San Fernando Valley has become predominantly Latino and therefore has lots in common with other places. For the API community, the main movement has been into the San Gabriel Valley, Alhambra, Monterey Park, etc., but also places like Cerritos and the southern part of LA County. This change in South Los Angeles, and then I'm going to start moving to questions and answers, but is this interesting stuff? You liking this? Yeah. Okay. So one of the interesting changes in South LA that can be seen most dramatically is this change between the African American and Latino communities. And the easiest way to look at it is in the high schools. In South LA, these are the sort of 8 major high schools. Anybody have gone to one of these schools or worked in some of these schools? Anyway, if you're from South LA, you'll recognize them. Crenshaw, Dorsey, Fremont, Jordan, Locke. Manuel Arts is the one that's the closest to us. It's about 1.5 miles away. Washington Prep. This is what they look like in 1981, 1982. Look, for example, at Locke, which was 98% African American, or Manuel Arts, which was 2/3 African American. This is what they look like in 2008, 2009. Huge change. And you can see, let's look at Locke. Let's look at Fremont. So Fremont was 93% African American. Now it's 90% Latino, right? Very dramatic change, and you can imagine it's part of the disruption that's occurred between the two communities, particularly at the youth level, and it's one of the reasons why those organizations that are building ties, leadership ties between young African Americans and Latinos in places like South LA are incredibly important. One interesting subtext here I always like to talk about, with the exception of Dorsey, which is an unusual high school for a number of different reasons. Used to have a pretty big Japanese-American presence. People will know about the Japanese-American presence in Crenshaw. With the exception of that, for the other schools, there were exactly 37 white students in these schools in 1981, 1982. 2008, 2009, there were exactly 37 white students. We think they're the same students. And we're launching a research project called Leave No Child Behind, to which we are accepting contributions. USC, always on the pioneering edge of research. So of all that data, well, all that data is really important, and here's where I really want to speak to what the faith community in general and the Catholic community in particular can do. Of all that data, well, it's very interesting. If there's one data point that you should remember from the new census, it's this. The median age, half older, half younger, for non-Hispanic whites in the United States is 42 years. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders is 35. The median age for African Americans is 32. The median age for Latinos is 27. 42, 27. And that gap is actually bigger in California, 44, 27. That's a 15-year, or in California's case, a 17-year gap. It's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. One is it helps to explain the demographic change and what's driving it. Because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age, right? But believe me, there are challenges. So the other thing it helps to explain is the fact that our racial gap has become a generation gap in which the old do not see themselves in the young, and it winds up having important political and social policy consequences. We've been looking, by the way, what state in the United States do you think has the biggest generation gap? The brownest young, the whitest old? Good guess, wrong. Arizona. Think about Arizona. Think about the way the politics are playing out there, very heated around immigration, but not just immigration, fights about ethnic studies in the schools, right? And regardless of where you come on immigration policy per se, the fact that it's the most heated there, which does have to do with the fact that it became a portal for illegal entry too, but the fact that it's so heated there has a lot to do with this generation gap as well. And when we look at this generation gap, we find that it's been widening in California more than in the rest of the United States, but it's been widening in the United States. And as it's widened, the idea of making investments in the future has tended to fall. And when we take a look at this by state, we find that in the states where the generation gap is the biggest, state spending on capital outlays for the future investment is the lowest. In the states where the generation gap is the biggest, investment spending on human capital, education spending per student is the lowest. Now, what this means is that this has consequences. And it has consequences not just for those young people, right? Because to the extent that we don't invest in young people, we don't have a productive economy for the future to support all of us when we retire and actually become part of that 49% not paying taxes, but living on Social Security and Medicare and stuff like that. We want to have a productive group of people who are in fact paying taxes, right? So we need to be thinking about this, and we need to be thinking about this in particular because the United States has come into very significant challenges with regard to growing inequality. It's interesting that I'm giving this talk one day after the celebration, or some might view it a non-celebration, of the beginning of the Occupy Wall Street movement. But part of what motivated that movement and part of what motivated our economic crisis, this is a really interesting chart. It's the share of income going to the top 1% of U.S. taxpayers since 1917. And there's two peaks here. One is 1928, and the other is 2007, each 1 year before the economic crisis got triggered, right? But we've had a crisis of economic inequality in the United States. It's actually fed into our crisis of economic growth, because we've had a situation in which the wealthy got so rich that they were kind of almost forced to speculate with their money on increasingly crazy instruments, right? Where poor, middle class, working class people were often borrowing simply to maintain their standard of living or to buy that one last house before the American dream disappeared on them. And that inequality got churned through a deregulated market. So for those who were wealthy, there were credit default swaps and all sorts of very unusual instruments. And for working, middle class, poor folks, mostly actually working and middle class, there were subprime mortgages, right? And we were so disconnected as a nation that when the canaries in the mine, the first people to lose their homes, were Black and Latino homeowners in places like Fontana and Riverside and San Bernardino and Orlando and Las Vegas. People said, that can't happen to me. We were disconnected, we were deregulated, and we were unequal. And most of the debate in the country has focused about whether or not we re-regulate the economy. It's not focused on how do we reconnect. It's not focused on how do we use that to deal with some of the issues of underlying inequality. And that is important because if we kind of reproduce this inequality into the future, we will continue to have an underinvested in group of young people. And if we reproduce the disconnection into the future, we will have an underinvested in group of young people. So this is incredibly important, and I'm going to just, looking at the time, jump over 5 more minutes?
At least 10 more minutes.
Okay, 10 more minutes and then a thrilling conclusion. I've built myself up now. This is important for 2 reasons. One is there's a big confusion in the United States about our inequality. And our inequality actually has two sources. One is the way in which the super wealthy got super wealthy in the stock market, financial instruments, tax favoritism, those kind of things. So that actually explains kind of why the super rich got rich. But there's also been an underlying inequality that shifted for people who are working and range from working class people to sort of upper middle class people, right? And that's had to do with the changing returns to education. And what this graph shows you, the blue line shows you what the wage results were for people in 1979, and then the purple line shows you what the wage results were for people in 2009. And the interesting thing to note there is that the bottom dropped, the actual wage level dropped for people who have just a high school degree or less than a high school degree, whereas the wage went up for people who have a master's or a professional degree. Now this means two things. One is all you should send your children to USC because these expensive degrees will pay off, right? Second, it's part of what's going on is that we really need to lift the educational profile because education now matters more than ever. And when we have significant achievement gaps by race, by geography, etc., it makes it very difficult to deal with economic opportunity in the future. And this is important because we used to be one of the most equal states in the country, one of the most opportunity-rich places in the country. How many of you either moved here yourself or your parents moved to California to pursue your dreams? Yeah. And, you know, I remember California is where my parents who were in New York came. They actually came for another reason, too. This was the 1950s, and my sister had asthma, and they said that if you moved to Los Angeles, it would be really good for your asthma because it was such a dry climate. I guess they didn't know a lot about air pollution at that point. But they came because it was a place that you could really remake yourself. And I remember growing up in L.A., and I mean, I would move other places, and then when I'd get broke, and I go, I got to move back to L.A. because I can always get a job in Los Angeles, right? You could always make something of yourself in Los Angeles, and that's become much tougher to do, right? So we used to be a place of opportunity. We're now the 6th or 7th most unequal state in the country, depending on how you measure it. And those are measurements that are also differential by race, and that's what the rest of these maps would have shown. So what do I want to conclude with? Because the real question here is, what does this mean for community building? And then I want to talk a little bit about what does this mean for leadership, which I think is an important part of community building and a part of what you might think about. So one of the things that I think is really important is that when we think, I mean, this is really important for faith-based institutions like the Catholic Church. It's very important, I think, for political figures. It's very important for leaders, is to pitch to the coming California, not the past California. There's a lot of talk about restoring the way things were, right? So cool if you feel that, right? But they're not going back to the way things were. The demography is different. The technology is different. The economy is different. We have to go to the way things will be, right? We need to pitch to who will be the future Californians. We need to understand what the new technology will be. We need to understand what the new economy will be and play. You know, it's one thing to say, geez, it's terrible that people with a high school degree are doing badly. The answer is make sure everybody gets a high school degree, right? And that they move into a community college system that helps propel them forward. The economy is changing. We need to pitch to a coming California, not a past California. That's particularly important for a church where all of your growth is occurring in the new folks, the new immigrants, the young people there. The second thing to understand, and this is really a misinterpretation, repeated in fact just yesterday by one of our presidential candidates, but I think it's a misinterpretation that happens both on the right and on the left, which is that this coming California is angry, right? And the interesting thing is it's actually a really aspirational constituency, not an angry constituency. If you do polling in the United States, particularly in California, African Americans and Latinos are more optimistic about the future than are whites. Now, what's interesting about that is they have less reason to be if you look at the statistics, right? If you look at the educational measures, what's happened during the recession, the loss of wealth, etc. But one fundamental mistake the right makes is to think of this as an angry group coming up, but it's the same mistake the left makes, which is think that this group will be motivated by the anger rather than by their aspirations. It's an aspirational community that wants to achieve, that has a lot of faith in the American dream. One of the most significant and important movements in the last 2 years has been the Dreamers movement. This set of undocumented young people who said that they were fundamentally American, and they dressed themselves up in the notion that they had a dream and they wanted to realize that dream as much as any other American. There was not a hint of anger in the way that they talked about it. If there was anger, it was about moving Obama to try to change policy, etc. It was a completely aspirational thing. So anyway, I think it's really important to understand that. I think it's really important to think about the concepts of social justice as linking people. And I think it's really important to think about the role of faith and faith institutions and faith-based organizing in connecting people. I realize you're taping me, so I'm going to take this jacket off because we're amongst friends. And also because it's hot. The central role of faith in a way of linking to people's values, right? Linking to people's aspirations, and also providing a way to bridge across generation and geography. We're not just separated generationally and racially, we're also separated geographically. And the work that people can do to bring suburban churches together with inner city churches so people can meet face to face, or to bring suburban ministries together with inner city ministries, those things are incredibly important for really linking ourselves in a sense of a common California. This also means, and this is either heretical or something that you will embrace warmly, I hope you will embrace it warmly. We have a friend in South LA named Anthony Thickpen, who runs an organization there called SCOPE. It's a community-based organization that does a lot of organizing around social justice issues. And Anthony, who I always credit for this because, when it's a wonderful quote, you'd like to claim it's your own. But instead, people will find out eventually someone else said it. So Anthony said, we need to be, there are people who are empire builders, and there are people who are empire builders, and there are people who are movement builders. There are people who want to build their own institution, and there are people who want to build the ecosystem, right? So what that means for organizing is you're only strong as an institution in the context of a lot of other strong institutions, right? Where there's a strong institution and culture of organizing. And the Catholic Church will not be a strong church all on its own. It's strong in a context of a lot of other faith-based institutions that are Muslim and Jewish and Protestant also finding their way and their strengths to be able to build that. You're actually only as strong as the ecosystem you're in, not just the institution that you're part of. And what that means, let's see what this last, that's simply an advertisement for you to read all of our work, which of course you should do. But what that means is that we need to think about leadership in a fundamentally different way. And this is where I will close, and it's a close again with a quote taken from someone else, a guy named Victor Quintana, who was an organizer of farm workers in Sinaloa, Mexico. And Victor came to an institute that we ran in Santa Cruz when I was there. We ran it for 5 years. And it was an institute bringing together organizers from Latin America with organizers from Latino communities in the United States to think about transnational ties. And this was back in the 90s before people were talking about this a lot. And at the end of one of those institutes, Victor leaned back and said, there's only two kind of leaders in this world, leaders who like the game, the jigsaw puzzle, and those who like the game of chess. And we looked at him like you're looking at me. What does that mean, right? And Victor said, to clarify, that, in chess, the pieces are only two colors, usually black or white. In the jigsaw puzzle, the pieces are many different colors, and indeed a single piece can be multi-hued. In chess, some pieces are far more powerful than others. You get really bummed out when you lose your queen. In the jigsaw puzzle, every piece is important. And you know that because how many of you have come to the end and there's one piece missing and you are so frustrated, right? In chess, you literally get ahead by knocking somebody off their territory. In the jigsaw puzzle, you make progress by fitting the pieces together so seamlessly that you don't know where one ends and another begins. In chess, the object is to win. In the jigsaw puzzle, the object is to complete the tapestry. And we as a nation, certainly we as a state, have been playing way too much chess and not enough jigsaw puzzle. We've been pitting race against race, city against suburb, immigrant against long-timer, Republican against Democrat, when we're all generation against generation, when we are in one state with one future, and the responsibility of leaders, regardless of what institution you're in, if you're in a university, if you're in a church, if you're in a community organizing group, if you're a business person, is to figure out what does it mean to lead across boundaries in a way that makes us greater than the sum of our parts, that makes us a whole state, a whole California, a whole people. Thank you.
I'll ask Dr. Pastor to stay up here for question and answers, but before you ask that first question, I'm going to run and get the mic. So you can put your hands up, but you got to wait a second.
There's a couple questions back there.
Hey, Manuel, very nice. Are there data out there to suggest that there are generational differences in how individuals interact with faith-based organizations, or are there expectations of what faith-based organizations do for them or what they do for those faith-based organizations? Is there some sort of change going on that regard?
Yeah, there's a thing, by the way, that's called the Public Religion Center, which is in Washington, D.C., has a great website, all sorts of data on this. So some of what I'll be repeating is really borrowing from some work they've done. And you can also look at the Pew Center that has some great stuff looking at religion and civic life. And so first, people who are older have tended to engage more traditionally, and people who are younger, excuse me, are generally more searching, and they often find it in different kinds of ways. And what that means is, and they also, one of the problems I think the Catholic Church is going to face is, and it's a very interesting thing, they're going to be releasing a study, this center, next week. And one of the questions, you're not putting this on the web for a couple days at least, right? Okay, good. Because we promised not to scoop them. But one of the things they found out, which is pretty interesting for people to think about, young people who are millennials looking for churches, one of the first questions they ask is whether the church is gay-friendly, because they don't want to be part of a church or an institution that does not accept people. I mean, they have gays and lesbians in their lives, right? And so they see that if an institution is not accepting of that they feel like there's not a place for them as well. And the fact that that's actually a question young people ask, trying to search for a church that they will be part of, is a very interesting thing. They also tend to, be a little bit more loosely connected to churches and institutions, so that they will not, I grew up a Catholic, and many people who are Catholic stay Catholic kind of, for the rest of your life without ever sort of questioning their thinking, right? There's a lot more questioning that goes on and a lot more searching and moving from institution to institution. One of the things, and I, by the way, recommend this to every research center on a campus that's actually dealing with social science around civic life. One of the folks in our institution who just collaborated with us in this report is a evangelical who is very interested in social justice stuff. And so it's a really good insight on the evangelical community, particularly that part of the young evangelical community that's concerned about the environment, that's concerned about immigrants, as well as being concerned about morality and things like that, and thinks that the way that they act publicly is important to the way that they act privately, too. And so you see a lot more searching with young people. And so I think trying to figure out how people can accommodate different views and also can accommodate people touching in and out before they form permanent affiliations is very important for any faith-based institution.
I was going to mention that the millennials are also colorblind. I mean, they do not see in color, which, you know, coincides with what you were exactly saying, and the perception that acceptance is very important to them. They're also, what I've experienced is very public service oriented, and they will put that above the dollar, especially when they go to their jobs. This is what I'm seeing. So I know for what it's worth, and, you know, just the age group that my children are and that we're dealing with. And I think that's a big plus if we're going to all come together to create that tapestry that you speak about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one thing to realize is that young people really value diversity, right? So, and there's actually some interesting factors which are driving them more to it currently that are going to keep them there. One is, there's a couple things which is interesting. One is they have been tending to grow up in more diverse situations, right? So I mean, literally, I said this when Obama was running the last time, that for young people, the idea that the smartest guy in the room is the black guy, it's no surprise, right? So the idea that they would vote for him, they had no issues with it, where for an older generation, it's a little bit more like that was not part of their experience, right? So I think they grew up in a more diverse setting. There's two other factors which are actually going to be interesting for diversity. One, which people aren't paying, so structural, right? One, which people aren't paying attention to. Young people are not buying houses like an earlier generation. The reason they're not is because they just saw a lot of people get burned on real estate because they went ahead and sacrificed and bought in like Riverside and San Bernardino and the exurbs, and then they wound up losing everything, right? And so they're saying this is really not a good investment, right? I don't really want to do what other people did, which is when it comes time, I've got just enough money, what I'm going to go do is buy a house. I'm going to drive till I qualify, right? I'm going to go to a suburban neighborhood which is less diverse, more middle class, etc. So they're staying in cities. And because they're staying in cities, they're encountering more diverse folks, not just where they work, but also where they live. That has a permanent effect on the way, whether or not you value diversity or not, right? The last thing, and it actually ties to something, it's kind of bad news, but it may be good news too. I had an interesting conversation with my son. My son is 26, and his girlfriend is 22. And so I was talking to him about something, and he said, you know, Dad, about his girlfriend who's 22, you know, she's from a different generation. She just doesn't get it. And what he meant by that was something really interesting, which is that there's a generation coming out of college, coming into the labor market, in a labor market that does not work at all for them, right? So her expectation is that she will never have a job. Not a job in a way that was traditionally defined, that like actually has a place, right, that you go to and health benefits and a career trajectory, that instead you will pursue your love, right, which in her case is music, right, because there's no real jobs out there anyway, right? So why not try to make things on your own? So it's a new, more entrepreneurial, less job-focused. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that social justice element, because if you don't feel like there's something out there for you as a job, why not pursue what you love, right? So these are factors that are not just the attitudes of the young, but some structural factors that are pushing them more to diversity, pushing them more to some of the social justice stuff. And isn't it any surprise that it's a ragtag group of young people that have actually propelled Occupy and lifted up the issues of inequality, when in fact so many Washington think tanks have been trying to do it unsuccessfully for years?
Just a quick question. I don't know if you covered this earlier. I apologize. I was a little bit late. But Lisa just mentioned that the young people are service-oriented. That's certainly promoted by high schools, promoted by colleges, and so on. But I also read surveys that say one of the biggest problems with young people today is they don't have much civic engagement. Now, how do you link those two things together? Is service just a kind of thing that is a temporary phase that fits on the CV and looks pretty good to a future employer? Civic engagement, I think, would be really much more focused on the larger political reality. Kids that alienated from the political polarization. What data do you have that would shed any light on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, the data is pretty imperfect because I think the ways that we measure civic engagement are imperfect, right? So we don't count, so here's, everybody uses their kids, right? But so when the crisis happened in Haiti with the earthquake, my son threw a concert at his house, raised a bunch of money, and sent it to 7 different charities. Now, it was a little bit self-serving. He wanted to have a place for everybody to listen to his band, but still, that didn't get captured, right? And he's also, and I think a lot of young people were highly mobilized by the Obama campaign. The participation of young people in phone calls there. One thing that's a bit worrisome is a lot of young people really had high expectations of change, perhaps unrealistic expectations from the point of view of those of us who are a little bit older, and they're pretty alienated right now. And I think we're likely to see we've seen a big drop-off in their participation in those kind of activities. And I think that we'll see a big drop-off in their voting this year, which will be, really tragic in a way because it's so interesting to see people get engaged and willing to participate regardless of the political party that they may wind up falling into. So I think we measure civic engagement imperfectly, and I think we need to create more vehicles for people to be able to see small successes that keep them engaged in doing stuff. And you're right, around the service stuff, there is some resume padding that's going on, and that's very different than having it be heartfelt.
I admire your golden words comparing chess game plus it's a puzzle, I think you mentioned that build movements, not the organization and empire. And that's what I think we need. What I hear is love and charity, or doing something for the people. They cannot do anything for you. And so that's what we really need, especially now. We don't need a chess game. We need a puzzle, everybody together, and then work together I feel sorry for the people who are born without their no fault, under poor parents, and poor condition, living condition, no good education, no good job, no nothing, and yesterday someone said 47% of U.S. people wants a handout. They're lazy. They don't want to work. I'm not going to do anything for them. I think that's a really false statement. So, do you think we should move together, revive the movement to build this nation as a puzzle? So, are you heading that movement now? Or?
I'd like to say that researchers never head movements. Researchers research and support movements. That's because I've developed such a respect for the organizers that do this work that I know that I'm a junior partner in the work that they're doing. I do think that one of the things that's been missing is a sense that, we rely on each other to be able to move forward over time. And that sense of social cohesion needs to be broad and include a lot of different people. And I think that this is where faith plays a really important role, because I think that it's hard, in the people, I'm an economist by training, which is basically a character defect. And, economists think about everything in terms of self-interest, right? So they often even think about altruism in terms of self-interest, right? Like I help people because it makes me feel good about myself, right? And I feel like, so I helped 3 people today, so I feel 3 times as good as I did yesterday when I only helped 1 person, right? The thing about faith which I think is important, is it moves beyond self-interest, which is not to say you shouldn't be also a self-interested person, but it moves to the question of identity, right? That we do good because it's part of our identity as human beings to do good. And that doing good, that helping of others, not because you're looking to be celebrated, but because you view that as an important part of who you are as a person, that is a sort of internal identity, right? That I think is something that faith brings to people, along with stuff. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. So more questions, yeah.
Is there anything on your research that suggests that we're going to see more Latinos in grad school or in college? And whether we're going to see that or not, what do you think the consequences of that is going to be?
Well, two things. We're not going to see that without efforts, right? Because right now, Latinos are very underrepresented in college, even less represented than African Americans relative to the population. And also dealing with a very challenging set of educational institutions in terms of being able to propel people forward. I think if we made more movement on that, it would be good for a number of different reasons. And of course, it's easy for me to say that I'm Latino, and you might think this is self-serving. But let me say why I think it'd be good for the entire country. Partly because it's a growing demographic and you want to make sure that people are successful, etc. But I actually think it's good for a whole other reason. And it's the following. And it's got to do with the way that we think about race in the United States and the way that Latinos think about race. So I have a graphic I didn't show. And it's about the racial identity of Latinos. Because it turns out 1980, actually they asked a pilot question in 1970, but 1980 was the first year that they asked people whether or not they were Latinos or Hispanics. And they first asked you what race you were, whether you were white or black or Asian or Native American or other, and then they asked you whether you were Latino or Hispanic. And about 42% of Latinos marked that they were other. And the census said, well, it's the first year we did it, the Latinos are confused, they'll get it right next year, right? So in 1990, they asked the same question, what race are you? And then they asked whether you were Hispanic or non-Hispanic. And more Latinos than in 1980 marked themselves as other. And so the census said, well, gosh, I mean, one thing you could have thought was, well, maybe this is a bad question, right? But the census, very firm, thought, let's look at this. And they looked at the answers, and they found that where the Latinos marked other, they were writing things like Chicano, or kind of like getting real proud and shouting, basically, right? So they said, what we need to do is we're going to change the order of the question. We're going to ask people first whether they're Hispanic or non-Hispanic. That way they get it out of their system. And then we'll ask them what race they are, and finally they'll tell us whether they're white or black or Asian. And so in 2000 they did it. They reversed the order. And more Latinos than ever marked other. So in 2010, here's what the census did. So finally in 2010, the percent marking other went down. And here's why. Because in 2010, where it says Hispanic, it says underneath it in bold, you may not have noticed this, Hispanic is not a race. And then when it gets to race, it says Hispanic is not a race. And 42% of Hispanics marked other, right? Explicitly not following the directions, right? So, why is that interesting? Because it means that Latinos in general have a much more fluid notion of what race means than people in the United States do, right? They actually also tend to have a much more fluid sense with regard to income, right? That people who are poor, working class, upper class are all part of the same community. And that cohesiveness, right? That kind of fluidity around race you're ascribing to the new millennials is also very much the case with Latino, which is not to romanticize. There's racism in Latino communities, etc., but there's a fluidity around racial identification. There's a fluidity around income, class identification, which I think may be very useful in a more diverse America. So having more people who are in leadership positions who bring that kind of attitude, I think could be a good thing. So.
I'm sorry. My question is regarding more the policy and political implications of what you were showing through data. We were talking about this new millennial generation that's kind of free, willy-nilly, diversity, fuzzy-wuzzy, we're all over the place. But what does that translate to politically? Sacramento still kind of operates the same, and we're working within the context of infrastructure and master plan that was developed in the 1960s. So how is this millennial generation going to affect the government system? Are we going to be looking at movements and reform? What do you see down the line?
Well, I think we are actually. I mean, there's some interesting groups that have been doing organizing in the state of California. I think we'll see it in this election and then see it in the next couple of elections, which have been doing organizing around trying, and I think the big shift is trying to get occasional voters, young voters, lower income voters, minority voters, to show up to the poll. And what's different about the organizing that's been going on, both in 2010, showed some results in 2012, is they're speaking to people's aspirations and not their anger, right? Because the usual model is like, you should be pissed off about what's happening. And people are like, yeah, I'm angry, right? And then they'll stay home because they're angry and they're alienated, right? If you're aspirational, you engage people, right? Yes, you can change the state, etc. And I don't know whether it'll happen in this election, but given both the demographics and this kind of organizing, I would say that if not in this cycle, within the next couple cycles, you'll see a pretty big change. Now, what's happened is that we've locked ourselves into a pretty old set of rules. We've got a 2/3 rule on whether or not you can raise revenues. However, that's probably going to change because within the next election, next two elections, you're going to have a 2/3 plurality in both Assembly and Senate to raise taxes. And that will change what we do in the state of California. We've locked ourselves in with Prop 13, which protects a lot of older residents, but it does some really bad things for young people who are buying homes, who have to buy new houses and pay the full freight in terms of tax revenue. So, just one personal example. I live in Pasadena. I pay 10 times in property taxes what the house across the street pays, right? When the police come, they don't provide 10 times the service to me. They don't clean up the street 10 times better, right? I just pay 4 times the taxes because that house was bought a really long time ago. The other thing about Prop 13, which people don't realize, some people do, is that Prop 13 revalues houses when they're sold. And it also revalues commercial property when it's sold. However, commercial property, which is often, it's sold, but there's all sorts of ways you can transfer commercial property without changing title. And because of that, the burden of property tax has moved from residences to, it's moved from commercial property owners to residential property owners, and it's moved from being more evenly spread across age to being very unevenly spread in terms of young people buying houses for the first time. Boy, if you're not talking about a recipe for political conflict in the future, I don't know what you're talking about, right? I mean, if you expect young people to continue to, the chart I didn't show, which I got to show, is the dependency ratio in California. Dependency ratio means the ratio of old people and young people to working age population. The dependency ratio is set to increase by about 1/3 over the next couple of decades, which meaning that each young worker is going to have to support basically 4 retired people compared to supporting 3 retired people currently. You might want to rework Prop 13 so we have some more property tax revenues to educate those people so they can actually support folks, right? So we're actually a changing state demographically, but we've got some really weird old things that were put in place. Prop 13 in 1978-79, the 2/3 rule at about the same time, right? Actually, it's part of that. And as a result, we're like a new, changing, young state operating with some really old, inelastic regulations and rules. And you know what happens with that is if you ease that, you can have elastic shift. If you don't, you have a big breaking point. And the big breaking point could be kind of problematic. Like, we should, okay, you may not think this. This is just my view, right? We've got to change Prop 13. However, we have to protect older people who are in their houses, particularly lower income older people, right? But if we don't change Prop 13 now, the tsunami of change isn't going to pay attention to that issue. It's just going to change Prop 13 by saying let's reevaluate everything, right? So we need to be making the kind of changes we need to do now where we're still elastic, lest we have a really brittle system that breaks.
Can we have one more question? I'll reserve it for Father Sayer. I think I saw your hand.
That's religious privilege.
Being the last, I'll actually ask two. The first one is just a debate of a friend of mine who's made me mad. California has to get, or Los Angeles has to give up one more title, according to him. I used to think of LA as the most diverse city in the world. He now says it's Houston. Do you know if that's true or not?
It may well be. You know, the city that's also outcompetes us in the state of California is Santa Clara. Santa Clara County has a higher share of immigrants than Los Angeles County. And it's a much more diverse set of immigrants. It's a very small African-American population. That's where they're losers, right? In terms of diversity. Houston actually is a very diverse population.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
The other question, my main question is, I saw a statistic from somebody. I never saw the data behind it, but that the number of Catholic men, it may have already crossed that point, but is very close to it, of Hispanic, will be Hispanic. Young Catholic men will be majority
Hispanic.
Hispanic, yeah. Have you seen anything on that, or?
Some of that can be teased out from some of the data that was presented at the beginning, but it's quite likely that that's the case. And it's also quite likely that that remains a searching generation. You know, one of the things we need to be, you know, people are people, right? So when we say about the millennials, right, they're searching. I know that sometimes the image people have in mind is, oh, that means white millennials searching for religion, right? But the Hispanic young folks that's why the Hispanic evangelical church is having such success recruiting, right? Because there's also a way in which people who at that age are searching for what religion they want to be part of find some meaning in smaller institutions, right? More intimate and personal institutions, etc., often which have exactly the same kind of rules around social morality that the Catholic Church has, right? So I do think, by the way, so number one, that's a real statistic. And number two, the church doesn't have a lock on that population, right? Because there's many different avenues that people can go to and that they feel very excited about. So the big thing, to return to the kind of big point, is people want, I mean, it's funny to have the economists and sociologists talking about faith, but you asked me to speak. I think that what people are looking for is faith that has meaning, not just in their private life, but in their public life, right? Faith that not only just gives them a connection to God and a sense of what will happen to them when they die and their relationship to the Spirit, but also something that provides a guidepost as to how you're supposed to act with other people, how you're supposed to stand in solidarity or not with other people, and what your role is in the world. So thinking through, I think people who come to the Catholic Church who are young are very attracted by the social justice ministry, and there may be parts of it, the church, that they don't feel that much connection with, but that they feel is real and authentic and connects for them, right? I think they're looking for faith in the public square as well as faith in their personal lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pastore. Thanks to Dr. Pastor for being with us. I'm going to put his address up tonight on the web. No, I'm kidding. I don't know if I've been able to hide it, but I've been a sociologist moderating tonight, so I hope it's gone well. It's been wonderful to have you. He actually inadvertently gave a plug for our next speaker. That one slide he had about the Catholics in America survey, our speaker in October is one of the sociologists that designed that survey. She's going to take us inside those numbers, but then try to give us a sense of what do those numbers mean. And so, Father Sayer, your question, I guarantee you she'll be able to speak to that. So pick up the flyers as you leave this evening. It's been wonderful having you, and we look forward to seeing you in October. Thanks again to Dr. Pastor.